Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is at the White House for an historic moment. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain will sign a monumental peace deal with the Jewish state.
Well, the question now, will other Arab nations do the same, or will they wait to see who wins the U.S. election in November? CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell explains.
A unique open-air concert in the southern Israeli city of Beersheba began with a surprise.
We'll play you two national anthems, one the Israeli one and the other one of the United Emirates, with whom we are going to sign a peace treaty.
And things are already happening over there as an Israeli model traveled to Dubai for a fashion shoot with a Dubai-based model. Signs of the warm reception that much of Israel is giving the historic agreement. Prime Minister Netanyahu will sign the normalization of relations with the UAE and Bahrain, culminating years of hard work.
I hold in my hand the historic draft peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and the historic declaration of peace between Israel and Bahrain. This is a great turning point in the history of Israel and in the history of the Middle East. I also promise you, according to what I see here, that additional countries are on the way.
It strengthens Israel and the pragmatic, moderate Arab countries in front of the radical Muslim camp represented by Turkey and Iran. Those two countries and the radical Islam camp was counting on the fact that as long as they work against Israel, all Arab countries will be with them.
But that didn't happen, as Israeli Ambassador Zvi Mazel noted that the Arab League refused to back a Palestinian resolution condemning the deal. Mazel once served as ambassador to Egypt, the first Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel more than 40 years ago.
We collaborate especially on intelligence level, security level, but there is no normalization.
Now Egypt can only watch as the Emirates and Bahrain stand to benefit economically, technologically, and in other ways with Israel.
So Egypt now, as I understand, they don't say it openly, but they regret not having normalized really relations with us and have not benefited from the possibilities.
Nevertheless, Mazel tells CBN News he thinks others in the Middle East are waiting to see how November's U.S. elections play out.
They would like to see that President Trump is elected and continues his policy. So they will be sure if they go on and normalize with Israel.
And then there's another major player.
Saudi Arabia is in the Arabian Peninsula, where the birth of Islam happened some 1400 years ago. They would like to have open relations with Israel, but they have to wait to see what happens.
Mazel says while he's surprised about the peace moves, he sees it as an important step forward for everyone. Chris Mitchell, CBN News.
It is an important step forward. We'll be covering this as it unfolds. You can watch History in the Making today on the CBN News channel, our CBN News app, and other digital platforms for CBN Israel. Tune in at noon Eastern Time to see our live coverage of the signing ceremony. Well, in other news, the Atlantic hurricane season is on track to be one of the most active ever. A Category 2 storm is now headed for the Gulf Coast. John Jessup has more on that from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. Residents in parts of the Gulf Coast are bracing for days of potentially life-threatening weather. Hurricane Sally is forecast to make landfall near the border of Alabama and Mississippi, bringing historic flooding and dangerous storm surge. George Thomas has this look at the slow-moving storm system that's already causing problems.
This is the scene in Kill, Mississippi, more than 24 hours before Hurricane Sally is expected to make landfall. Tidal surge already pushing water onto roadways, lawns and docks as residents in coastal parts of the state prepare for the storm's arrival.
It would be done to stay here.
Dramatic satellite images from space last night showing an explosion of lightning inside the hurricane as the storm got closer.
As we look at our track here, Sally is likely to remain a hurricane, once again, Category 1 status until about Wednesday, when it is making landfall into Wednesday morning, somewhere in between Mississippi and Alabama. As Sally continues to interact with land, decreasing in strength,
Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi declaring states of emergency in anticipation of the hurricane, as officials warn to prepare for the possibility of days of extremely dangerous weather.
The slowing of the storm, that is concerning. The longer and it stays out in the Gulf of Mexico, the more and higher the likelihood is that it continues to grow.
Right now, forecasters say that extremely slow-moving system could bring life-threatening storm surge of up to 11 feet for parts of southeast Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and rain in excess of 20 inches in some areas.
If this one hits the coast at a Cat 2, I'm thinking we're going to have at least 6 to 7 foot of water where we standing at.
Meanwhile, in the French Quarter in New Orleans, some businesses boarding up.
I mean, after Katrina, anything around here and anything on the water, you're going to take serious. You know, you can't take anything lightly.
For a city surrounded by water and painful memories of Hurricane Katrina, the Army Corps of Engineers in New Orleans not taking any chances, closing the floodgates in preparation for Hurricane Sally.
We have it up to 100-year level protection. We're still doing some things like armoring. That's building in resiliency into the levees. So if they are overtopped by a hurricane someday, they won't have a failure.
This year's hurricane season is particularly busy. For the first time in 50 years, there are 4 named storms already swirling in the Atlantic at the same time. George Thomas, CBN News.
A busy hurricane season indeed. Thanks, George. Turning now to the West Coast fires, where dozens of people in Oregon are missing after flames consumed their towns. Evacuees now facing scenes of utter devastation as they return to their neighborhoods. In Oregon, where 6 towns have been destroyed, fire crews and canines are searching for bodies.
I had seen videos, but it's 1,000 times worse than I could have ever imagined.
Smoke from the fire is presenting a second hazard. Portland now has the worst air quality in the world, and officials are warning people to stay indoors as the smoke spreads. This satellite image showing it moving east across the country. Meanwhile, the fires are now a campaign issue. During President Trump's visit to California Monday, state officials blamed climate change for the fires. President Trump disagreed, pointing the finger at poor forest management. That prompted a response from Joe Biden.
When you have years of leaves, dried leaves on the ground, it just sets it up. It's really a fuel for a fire.
If you give a climate arsonist 4 more years in the White House, why would anyone be surprised if we have more America ablaze?
And in California alone, the total insured losses could top $13 billion. That's the amount recorded in all of 2017, when the state had 3 of the top 5 costliest fires in American history. Well, a warning to Americans from the Trump administration: do not travel to Hong Kong or mainland China. The concern is that they could face arbitrary detention and arbitrary enforcement of local laws. The advisory claims China uses those tactics for leverage over foreign governments and to pressure family members living abroad to return. Also on Monday, the United States banned imports of some goods from China's Xinjiang province due to the forced labor and oppression of Uyghur Muslims there. Well, for decades, the United States had a strong record of welcoming those fleeing poverty, violence, and persecution in their home countries. In the last 3 years, however, America has dramatically reduced the number of refugees allowed into the country. As Heather Sells reports, refugee advocates are asking the Trump administration to reverse that trend.
Around the world, nearly 30 million refugees are looking for a home after fleeing a dangerous homeland. More than half are children, and many live in crowded camps with no school. Blessing, an orphan and victim of trafficking, fled her country at age 12.
It was very difficult to survive, and where I wasn't safe.
For almost 40 years, the U.S. has welcomed an average of 95,000 refugees a year. In the last 3, however, the Trump administration sharply reduced that annual number to the current 18,000 for 2020.
Refugee resettlement numbers are now at an all-time low in the United States. And what that has meant is that people in harm's way who literally have no other option for safety, some have died. Some are still in harm's way. Many have been promised by the United States that they would be able to be reunited with their family members. These are people who have already been vetted, who have already been approved, who were supposed to come in 2017 and are still without safety, are still not with their families.
Despite the reduced numbers, the administration still promotes its commitment to international religious freedom. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told CBN's David Brody last year the focus is to create safety for refugees in their home countries.
You know, we're still the most generous, welcoming nation anywhere in the world. Our objective has been to try and do what those people really want in most cases, which is just to stay in their own country.
Refugee advocates dispute that generosity, especially as refugees still suffer because of their faith.
The administration has claimed to support people who are fleeing religious persecution, and yet, with the numbers, we're seeing such few refugees coming in. There are only 946 Christians fleeing religious persecution resettled this year, which is the lowest it's ever been.
Blessing is now finishing high school and says she's grateful that the U.S. accepted her.
America is a place where dreams really come true. Like, if you work hard, if you're determined and you're focused, you can actually achieve what you really want.
The State Department must decide by October 1st how many refugees it will admit next year. It must also consult with Congress. So far, no meeting has been set. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thanks, Heather. And Gordon, another factor to include or consider is that religious persecution is on the rise.
It is. It's the worst it's been since the Roman Empire. I mean, these are staggering numbers around the world. You know, I'm fine with the administration's policy on this. They've certainly highlighted it more than the previous administration. The genocide that was occurring to ancient Christian communities in Iraq and Syria under ISIS. It took them forever to recognize that. And the reason is, once you start to declare it for what it is, that it's a religious genocide, certain things get triggered in terms of foreign policy, and they just frankly didn't want to trigger it, and they didn't want to recognize what ISIS was doing. This administration does recognize it, and we need to applaud that. At the same time, you know, I understand from what we're dealing with this pandemic, you can't have the same numbers, but my goodness, you can't create safe areas in Pakistan. You can't create safe areas in Iran. There are many areas of the world that is an impossibility. So can we open it up for those? If it is possible for people to find a safe place, great, but lives are at risk, and we've always welcomed. Listen to the words of that wonderful girl and what she said, how she honored America. America, if you work hard and you have commitment and you have purpose, you can achieve your dream. What a great statement from someone. It's one that I think we need to remind ourselves. In America, if you have hard work, if you have commitment, you can achieve your dream.